Okay, welcome everybody for the second FAFP webinar. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Please keep your video and audio off throughout the duration of today's program. We'll ask the speakers to answer questions from the audience at the end of the presentation, and we'll have a team of volunteers who will be monitoring the chat box and facilitating your questions with the speakers. So please do enter any questions you have directly in the chat box. We will be recording the program to post on fafp.net, which we have recently revamped, so please check that out. So today we have two speakers. The first will be Kimberly Livsey. She's a senior emergency coordinator with the US FDA. Ms. Livsey serves as a subject matter expert related to emergencies such as illness, outbreaks, natural and man-made disasters, special events, intentional acts of food contamination, and other emergencies involving FDA regulated products. She's responsible for assisting FDA district. Sorry, excuse me. Lost my script. All right. She is a retail food specialist in the FDA state cooperative programs in Atlanta, Georgia, acting as a technical specialist, assisting them with the adoption of the food code and development of the retail food safety programs. As an RFS and in her current role, Ms. Livsey has led and performed food safety surveillance oversight for national special events such as the 44th and 45th presidential inauguration, 2014 African Summit, 2020, 2016, and 2012 national political conventions, and the 2004 G8 Summit. She has commanded disaster response efforts for Hurricane Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Irma. Ms. Livsey is a 2013 recipient of FDA Award of Merit for exceptional performance in the planning, management, and implementation of the Food Safety and Defense Mission at the 2012 Republican and Democratic National Conventions. Before joining FDA, Ms. Livsey was an environmental health specialist with the DeKalb County Board of Health in Decatur, Georgia. She served as a supervisor in the food protection program, was the primary trainer of the staff. She graduated from Berry College in 1988 with a Bachelor of Science degree in biology. Shellie O'Toole joined Feeding America in September 2017 as a senior account manager, food industry partnership. Her supply chain division role is to serve as the liaison between the retailers and the Feeding America's 2,200 member food banks to manage national product donation partnerships, sourcing and distribution nutritious food for people facing hunger in America, working with prospective and current partners. Shellie develops and manages strategy and execution related to exploring, developing, piloting, launching, managing, and scaling donation programs. In this role, she's working to help the team achieve a goal of rescuing and distributing more than 1.9 billion pounds of unsold food to the Feeding America network. Shellie's partnership portfolio includes grocery retailers, convenience stores, food service distributors, and restaurants totaling 6,500 locations. Shellie has invested her entire professional career in the hospitality industry. She served nonprofit organizations in sales, membership recruitment, and retention roles for 25 years by fostering relationships and developing programs to service and help sustain and grow member and association businesses. Prior to joining Feeding America, she was the first managing director of member services for the Ohio Restaurant Association. Shellie and her team serve 1,700 members representing 300 Ohio restaurant locations, are responsible for generating 75% of the association's annual income. Shellie spent 5 years in hotel sales after earning associate degrees in culinary arts, hotel restaurant management from Hawking College in Nelsonville, Ohio. She lives in Westerville, Ohio with her husband, Michael, and their two dachshunds. She's a proud mother of 2 adult children. So with that, Kim, if you want to take it away.
Thank you, Jason. And good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Shellie, for all that you do. Feeding America is critical right now. So I just do want to applaud you, and that is one of the agencies that I donate to, especially in this current COVID environment. But just thank you guys for having me today. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am assuming that you can see my screen. How is the volume? Can you hear me?
Looks good, sounds good.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just want to thank Kanisha for inviting me and for you guys for welcoming me today. Our topic is going to be food defense. Is it something that's going to be beneficial for your industry, or is it just a bunch of hype? Okay, here we go. So just to give you some background on food defense, just some terminology. When we're talking about food defense, those are efforts to prevent the intentional contamination of food products, and that's by human means. There's a human intervention as the source of the contamination. And then most of us know what food safety is. That's efforts to prevent accidental or unintentional contamination of the food supply. And then there's also a term that used actually used to use this for food defense. We used to call it food security, but that's something totally different. That's having enough food, enough nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active lifestyle. So those are our terms that we're going to be talking about. Okay, so I can't see the chat, so Jason, you guys will have to help me. But everyone on the line, if you would put in now, type in the chat, whether you think food defense, and if you have any idea of the intentional adulteration rule passed by FDA in 2016, is it really something that's going to be helpful, or is it just hype? So you guys just let me know what the responses are. And I know I'm a government official, but I need you to be honest with me. Do you really think it's something that's helpful, or is it just hype? Another government regulation that they're making us do. So Jason, you have to help me out if people are responding.
So right now I got 100% helpful, help. So far, everybody says helpful.
Okay, so you guys are sucking up to the government this morning. I don't appreciate that. I need your honesty. No, but seriously, when you look at it, okay, so it's a balancing act. It's a seesaw, because on the one hand, the intentional adulteration rule the FDA has passed is really for those terror attack on the food supply. So those large scale incidents with a huge public health impact. So when you look at those types of attacks, you may say that the incidence is low. The likelihood of occurrence. And we can really look at it in food safety aspects as well. You know, when we're doing hazard analysis, we're looking at, okay, what's the likelihood of occurrence? And then what's the severity if it does occur? So with the food defense on the scale we're talking about, the likelihood of occurrence is low. It's low risk, but the severity, if something really does happen, that potential public health impact is going to have a high severity. So that's why it's critical that we have food defense in place. And if you think about it, it's just like the coronavirus pandemic that we're currently experiencing. We haven't had a pandemic since what, 1918, I think 1918 was the last worldwide pandemic. It affected about a third of the population. So it's been 100 years since we've seen anything like this. So most of us, we've never seen this in our lifetimes. So the likelihood of a pandemic, although we've been talking about it, I joined FDA in 2000. We've been talking about pandemics and the possibility since 2000, I'm sure. But the likelihood of it occurring, we thought was low. And now that it has occurred, we see that public health impact, that we have over 121 million cases and even over 2 million deaths worldwide. So that same likelihood of occurrence versus potential impact is similar with food defense. So why would the food supply? Why would someone want to use the food supply as a vehicle to harm others? Well, there would be significant public health consequences. There would be widespread public anxiety. People would lose faith in the government and also in the food supply. It would disrupt our economy. Our economy related to food 5% of the gross domestic product is food related, and there's about 1.4 trillion sales in the food sector each year. So it would have a huge impact if it could be pulled off. So if we look at the spectrum of intentional contamination and food adulteration, there's 4, I guess, categories or topics that we're looking at. You have your extremist groups. Back in 1978, a terrorist group contaminated oranges with silver globules. So these were oranges that originated out of Israel. A Palestinian group contaminated them, and a Dutch family's child consumed the product. And what they were trying to do is disrupt Israel's economic system. So they were trying to bring harm to Israel's reputation. So you have those extremist groups, and usually they're going to be motivated by political or ideological oriented motivation. And then you have your economically motivated adulteration. And we have seen this in recent history with the contamination of infant formula in China with melamine. Now, usually with the EMA, they're really doing it for economic reasons and not really trying to harm anyone, which was primarily the case with the infant formula, where they put melamine in to make the protein content of the baby formula look like it was more than what it was. But as some of you may know, this resulted in deaths of infants in China and many, many illnesses. And actually the personnel who were responsible for it actually were convicted, and 2 of them were executed and others were jailed. And then you may have that counterfeit or diversionary tampering, and most of us know the most popular case related to tampering was the Tylenol case back in 1982, where we had 7 people in Chicago actually died when a perpetrator took Tylenol off the shelf, lined it with cyanide or laced it with cyanide, put it back on the shelf, and then these people purchased this extra strength Tylenol and they died. And last, and the most dangerous way that product can be intentionally contaminated is by that disgruntled employee. It's just one of the recent cases in Lenexa, Kansas. There was an employee, he was disgruntled, he was laid off, his car got stolen, and he blamed his employer. And so he and his wife were contaminating salsa with a pesticide. And he was really making her do it. She didn't want to do it, but he was making her do it. And so it caused that they contaminated the salsa at a lunch period. And then about 2 weeks later, they contaminated the salsa at a dinner service at this particular restaurant. And so initially, when it first happened, people were thinking, it was maybe had something to do with the soda machine, maybe copper poisoning. And it wasn't until the second contamination that they realized. And also, he really told on himself because he was threatening his employer online as well. So most of these cases are small scale. And as I mentioned earlier, the cases that the intentional adulteration regulation covers is more of those terror attacks. So I want to just quickly share 2 case studies that are more on that large scale. So this first one was a Japanese factory worker. He poisoned frozen foods. So he was working at a food facility, and he was a contract worker, meaning he worked about every 6 months. He had to renew his contract, and he did not have the same benefits as full-time workers. So he became disgruntled, and he contaminated the frozen foods with malathion. It's used as a pesticide, and it's also used for treating head lice. And so there was frozen pizza, chicken nuggets, some frozen grains, and some corn croquettes that he contaminated. And his desire really wasn't to harm people, but he wanted to just upset the company because he was disgruntled with his current working conditions because he wasn't a full-time employee. However, if he had a stronger toxin or used a stronger toxin, it could have had severe consequences. Based on what he did use, there were over 2,800 illnesses and about 6.4 million packages of food had to be recalled. So other reasons why we're concerned, and some of you may have heard that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they've issued instructions for their followers to attack the food and water supply. That was back in 2014. They've actually, it's been reported that they've used the human prisoners as guinea pigs to test some of the poisons and how they would affect.
So then a second case study that we have is an individual. He used a counterfeit ID. He was outside of the UK. He used fake IDs to come into the UK, and he got a position at a food firm. And he was angry and he wanted to cause a terror attack. And his girlfriend was a pharmacist. So they were researching how they could use ricin to contaminate the food supply. And if he had been successful, this would have been a large-scale terror event. But he was captured before they could actually implement the plan. So the evolution of FDA's food defense policy, you can see from 2002 to actually present day. But the most significant time frames on this timeline would be 2004. That's when Homeland Security Presidential Directive 9 was initiated, which established a national policy to defend the agriculture and food system against terrorist attacks or major disasters. And this was issued by President Bush. So what it did, it required us to conduct vulnerability assessments of the agriculture and the food sectors, because the agriculture and food are considered critical infrastructures. So over the last 10 to 15 years, the bulk of FDA's work in food defense has been vulnerability assessments, working with the Department of Homeland Security, USDA, other governmental officials, academia, trade sectors, and also company representatives and components. So these are just some examples of the FDA vulnerability assessments that have taken place. And so quickly, if somebody would come off mute, which of these do you think are the most vulnerable? If you could somebody just come in, just pick one that may be the most vulnerable. Anybody? It's a participatory day, guys.
In the chat, we have bottled water.
Okay, bottled water. And you would probably think that, bottled water, everybody drinks it, it's widespread, it's in all countries. But actually what we found out is that there's no particular food that's more vulnerable than any other food. What we found is there are particular processes that are more vulnerable and that are high risk that need to be addressed. And those you can see on the screen is if you're a facility and you're handling bulk liquid or receiving large bulk liquids, if there's a liquid storage and handling on site, if there's a secondary ingredient handling or mixing, where you're coating, you're mixing, you may be reworking products, we found when we did an in-depth analysis of all of the vulnerability assessments done over the last 10 to 15 years, that those were the major things that firms needed to address or mitigate in their food defense plans. So our FDA's intentional adulteration rule passed in 2016. It establishes or requires us food firms to prevent or minimize the acts intended to cause that wide scale or that public health or harm. So any facilities that manufacture, if they process, pack, or whole food products, then they fall under this intentional adulteration regulation. Now, this does exempt retail establishments and it exempts farms. But although at retail, you may be exempted. It's still just good business to have food defense in place. And some of these same principles that are used in these large scale firms can be used at retail at that smaller scale, at that restaurant or grocery store level. So what is required? So facilities, they have to implement a food defense plan. And that food defense plan there has to be a vulnerability assessment. So similar to what we do with HACCP in food safety, you assess the hazards, what could go wrong or what are the hazards associated with this particular food product. It would be the same. What are the hazards that are associated with this, with my firm as it relates to food defense? And I identify, what are those critical steps that have to be mitigated to make sure that my system isn't vulnerable. And then you look at the mitigation strategies. What do I need to put in place to reduce that risk or that vulnerability? And then you have to monitor that procedure. What are we doing? Are we practicing what we put on paper? And then if we have a deviation, what are our corrective actions? And then we verify the process. So we take an overall look, maybe annually, of how are we doing? Are we meeting our goals within that plan? So very similar, actually based off that same concept that we've used with HACCP in food safety for years and years. And then there's always a reanalysis. Is it working? What do we need to change? And also there's records that have to be maintained, and there's training. So the compliance dates for businesses that are not small or very small, which are large businesses, July 26, 2019 was that implementation date. For smaller businesses, a business with fewer than 500 full-time employees, that date was July 27, 2020. And then very small businesses, they have modified requirements, and that date was July 26, 2021. So there's training that's also associated. So FDA, along with other stakeholders and industry and academia, have developed training to help with the implementation of the food defense. So the first training, food defense awareness, is the only one that's mandatory. So for those actionable process steps that firms have to identify, anyone who's actually conducting those steps and also their supervisors would be required to have this particular training. All the other training is for informational purposes. So overview of the intentional adulteration rule that just gives personnel who are taking that training an update on what actually that IA rule entails. And then we have other trainings regarding vulnerability assessments and mitigation strategies, how to implement those strategies, and then food defense plan preparations. So that training has been provided. And all of it is free, and most of it is online, which is very convenient for those that need the end users. So the inspection framework, another part of the intentional adulteration rule, is that we will start conducting inspections, food defense inspections. So the first tier will be quick checks, and they were due to begin in March of 2020, but due to coronavirus, that was pushed off. So we didn't start in March of 2020, but for those larger firms, we did start in August, doing just some very few establishments. And then the small firms are set to begin this month. And so we've also started that. So the checklist is just basically looking at 10 or 15 to 20 minutes, just looking to see or verify that that firm has a food defense plan in place and has all the elements in place. The second tier will be in 2 to 3 years, where we will actually have inspectors going out just doing food defense inspections, and they'll be looking at the effectiveness of the plan. Just like we would go out and do a HACCP verification, there'll be a food defense inspection to verify the elements in the plan and whether or not it's being properly implemented. And lastly, we also, as a resource, have a food defense plan builder that industry can use to develop food defense plans. This does not mean that by using this that you automatically meet the requirements, but it is a source that can be used. So just want to acknowledge our food defense director, John Woody, provided most of these slides, also some information from Diane Kelch. So if you have any questions, we do have a website, fda.gov, food defense, and you can also submit them to we have a technical advisory network where you can send questions. It's made up of industry, FDA and academia, where you can submit questions regarding food defense. So that concludes my presentation, Jason.
Does anybody have any questions? You can go ahead and put those in the chat. I guess I got one question. So with, intentional adulteration, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to sometimes find the source. So what, could you just briefly explain the process of trying to, when there's a suspected adulteration occurring, about how you trace back to find out what the actual cause was?
Well, I've never personally, I'm trying to think that I've never personally had to do that, but it would be similar to what we do for normal tracebacks. However, the key difference is that we would be doing this in conjunction with law enforcement. So law enforcement has a piece related to the criminal intent. Law enforcement would have the piece related to even collection of product, because based on what the toxin may be, FDA or state or local may not have that, the PPE or that technology or technical expertise that may be needed. So we've done exercises in the past where we would stand up in unified command with law enforcement and FDA. So from the food side of it, we would still do what we would normally do, go in and do the interviewing of the staff related to the process, where the FBI or the local law enforcement may be there at the same time interviewing staff related to the criminal intent.
All right, thank you very much. If there are no further questions, and you're going to stick around to the end, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So Shellie, you want to go next?
I'm all set. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, top of the afternoon to you and happy St. Patrick's Day. And that was very interesting, Kim. Great presentation, and thanks for all that you do. It's a pleasure to present to you today. As Jason said, I'm Shellie O'Toole, Senior Account Manager for Food Industry Partnerships with Feeding America. And in my role, I have the privilege of serving as the liaison between Feeding America Food Bank members and our national retail donors. And I see some of you today with Publix and Southeastern Grocers. So we work to develop, pilot, scale, and support food donation programs. So today I'll introduce Feeding America, what we do and who we serve, and then I'll share the historic challenges we now face. The pandemic created a perfect storm for the Feeding America charitable food system, unfortunately. I'll also share what hunger in America looks like now, what we've done to not only adapt to that perfect storm, but overcome incredible odds to increase distribution to hungry people in this country by 53%. And what we believe America's charitable food system will need in the future, and how it has shaped our priorities and how you can help. And throughout my presentation, I'll introduce you to real people and real hunger stories. So as I mentioned, throughout my presentation, I'll introduce you to real people and real stories of hunger. And in general, Feeding America is the largest hunger relief organization in the United States. But if you remember anything about us after today's presentation, I hope it'll be that people facing hunger are at the center of everything that we do. And through our network, we provide meals to more than 40 million people each year. And Feeding America also supports programs that prevent food waste and improve food security among the people that we serve. We educate the public about the problem of hunger, and we advocate for legislation that protects people from going hungry. What's important to know about our network is that we're a federated model, which means we're decentralized. So it makes us extremely agile and adaptive. We're made up of the national organization with offices in Chicago and Washington, D.C., our 200-member affiliate food banks who serve together, serve every U.S. county, the Feeding America affiliate food banks partners, and so that totals approximately 60,000 smaller food banks, pantries, schools, and other partners that distribute what was last year a record 6 billion meals. We also have 21 partner state associations made up of food banks, and they work on policy issues at the state and federal level. And they also participate in regional agri-hubs, which are cooperative organizations working to source and distribute produce and protein and dairy. And of course, none of this would be possible without millions, literally millions of volunteers, donors, and partners like so many of you and your organizations that make this network and our mission possible. So we're leaders in your community and nationally. We help local food banks reach more people in need, and we lead the national anti-hunger movement for a better tomorrow. And I'll talk some more about these bullets in my presentation. I wanted to share there are 9 Feeding America member food banks that serve the state of Florida, and each food bank has a designated service area. It's important to note that food banks act as warehouses, as food storage and distribution depots for the smaller frontline agencies, those 60,000 agencies I mentioned. So typically, they usually don't give out the food directly to the people that are struggling with hunger. So let's meet our first real story of hunger. I'm very happy they give me food during a difficult time, said Maritza, a mother and housekeeper who lost work because of the pandemic. Her husband, who works in construction, has also lost work, so the family has needed a little extra help to support their 2 children. She relies on donations from the food pantry at New Life Ministries in Hempstead, New York, which is a partner agency of Long Island Cares Food Bank. Talking a little about food safety, all of our Feeding America network food banks adhere to the same guidelines that grocery retailers, food manufacturers, and restaurants must follow. So food safety standards are reviewed in compliance audits. And then in addition, all food banks and branches operated by Feeding America are required to pass a third-party food safety scored audit. And that's a minimum of once every 2 years. The stringent food safety practices are vital not only for the health and safety of people we serve, but to the achievement of our mission to feed more people. And it's important to note that those compliance audits go beyond simple compliance. They're also designed to help members go really from good to great. We share best practices and put members in touch with experts, resources, and enhanced capability services to help each member really evolve and excel. We also offer grants to help food banks achieve successful audits and then provide specific guidance to help them navigate any potential crisis. And food banks are assigned Feeding America member engagement directors that manage that high-level relationship and offer that support. And all of these are expense-paid opportunities, which can really be a catalyst for a variety of food safety improvements at our local food banks. And then we also have a rigorous process in place to notify food banks and remove product from our system that has been recalled. And we provide all Class 1, Class 2 food, pet food, and nutritional supplement recalls to the food bank network on a daily basis. And also there's a legally binding contract between Feeding America and every network food bank, which outlines the mutual obligation, and they must adhere to the highest standards of nonprofit industry management, whether it's regarding finances, governance, fundraising, of course, food safety, inventory management, agency relations, et cetera. And then every 5 years, which this is happening this year, Feeding America reevaluates that contract to ensure it's still relevant. So that was when things were normal. So much for normalcy. As you know, March 11th, 2020, COVID-19 was declared a worldwide pandemic, and it rocked our world, right? We had to learn fast, not only in our food banking world, but in our personal lives. Social distancing, quarantining, and even Rona were some of the most frequently searched terms at the beginning of the pandemic. The Montgomery Area Food Bank, one of our members, stated, "This was a nightmare that no one ever imagined we'd have to confront in our lifetime. However, there was no time for pity. We had to get to work to help families." For our network, the pandemic proved to be, like I said, the perfect storm in terms of its impact on demand, supply, and disruptions to the network operating model. So being agile and highly adaptive has been critical in our ability to respond to the impact of the pandemic. The Second Harvest Food Bank of Southern Wisconsin shared, "Our systems, finances, and people have been challenged in ways we had never considered. What we've learned, or perhaps have simply been reminded of, is that we belong to a community of committed individuals and nimble organizations that can move mountains when called upon." So we were dealing with this huge increase in demand, which is still present. The need for food assistance surged at the outbreak of the pandemic and is enduring at levels not seen since the Great Depression. Food banks are still, as of last month, reporting an average 55% increase in the number of people seeking food assistance, with 40% seeking support for the first time in the early months of the pandemic. And just this month, we projected 1 in 8 people overall, so that's 42 million people in our country, could be food insecure this year, compared with 35 million people who lived in food insecure households in 2019, and that's per the USDA. And sadly, this includes 1 in 6 or 13 million children who could be food insecure this year because of the crisis. Meet 8-year-old Zoe. Her family is like so many. Her parents don't have consistent income to make ends meet. Her dad is a disabled vet and her mom stays home to take care of the kids. When they don't have enough food, her parents skip meals so the kids can eat. And they do all they can to keep balanced diets, but sometimes they eat rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, and rice for dinner just to stretch their dollars. They visit their local food pantry near Monroe, Louisiana, which is a food bank partner of the Food Bank of Northeast Louisiana. And there they get cereal and milk, lunch, and dinner from the pantry. And that means that Zoe can get the food she needs to learn and grow and pursue her dream of becoming a vet. After a lifetime of working and raising families, 5.3 million seniors in our country struggle to access enough food. The plight of seniors facing food insecurity in our country is often a silent struggle hidden by isolation and pride. The current number of seniors who are food insecure is still more than double the number 20 years ago. In Latino, African American, Native American, Alaskan Native, And some Asian households are more likely to face hunger compared to white households. And COVID also has had a disproportionate impact on these same populations when it comes to unemployment, hospitalization, and even mortality. While rural counties make up 63% of all counties, they represent 87% of counties with the highest rates of food insecurity. And there are three primary factors that drive high rates of food insecurity in these areas. One is lack of retail stores, social services, and transportation. The high cost of living and lower wage job offerings, compounded by poor levels of physical, financial, and economic health, and the high rates of multiple economic, social, and health challenges. And here's what hunger looks like in Florida. 1 in 8 people struggle with hunger in Florida, and 1 in 5 of those are children. Meet Marianne. She's a college student who turned to the campus pantry when she lost her job during the pandemic. Now, college pantries are relatively new and they're popping up in response to the rising rate of hunger on college campuses. Our research programs at Feeding America help us find this data. And this is one example. It really helps us learn more about who's vulnerable to hunger, where the gaps are in service, how effective our programs are at meeting the need, and how people come in and out of the food assistance system. Operationally, with the pandemic, we saw huge disruptions to food supply. Prior to the crisis, the charitable food system relied heavily on salvageable food waste rescued from retail and manufacturing food channels. And those are the channels the team that I works with are involved with. And that accounted for 70% of all food distributed by Feeding America. But the over-reliance on a few channels in the food supply chain really undermined our ability to respond effectively, given the pandemic's impact on the supply chain. I'm probably not telling you anything new, but charitable food from these channels virtually disappeared in response to all those spikes in consumer demand. And during the height of the pandemic, donations to food banks dropped between 40 to 70%. Also, food banks have been historically relying on volunteers for repacking and distributing food. And during COVID-19, food banks had to quickly innovate and move to low contact and no contact food packing and distribution models. And during the pandemic, food banks reported an average 67% decline in their volunteer base. Meet Sherman. He's a retired school bus driver living on a fixed income that doesn't cover all of his bills. He and his wife live 13 miles from the nearest town, so it's really not easy for them to get food. They do visit a pantry that partners with the Food Bank of Northeast Louisiana. In Sherman's County, 14.6% of people face hunger compared to nationally 11.5%. And the reality is that people in rural areas and people who are Black are more likely to face hunger. So it's really our job to expand and strengthen our food bank network so we can reach everyone who needs our help, wherever they are. And that includes a focus on equity, so we're able to serve the people who are at greater risk. More specifically, operational specific impacts included distribution methods. As I mentioned, the low touch and no touch to keep people safe, and implementation of safety protocols throughout the food banking and distribution center. For example, prior to the pandemic, food bank staff conducted store visits with receivers and retail store managers to develop that relationship and share opportunities and success tied to the food donation program. But health was a big concern, and some of the early actions taken by the network to maintain social distancing during food recovery, just to spend less time in the stores, included asking stores to stage the donations all in one place, to call and text the food bank or the agency, the pickup partner, with times when donations were ready. Also, reliance on increased levels of perishable food became evident as the supply chain upheavals contributed to shortages of the shelf-stable food. Additional opportunities in perishable food rescue had challenged our system. Although the network was already in a deep transition to perishable before the pandemic, 68% of the food we distributed was perishable. The pandemic brought even more perishable opportunity, which is obviously requiring us to improve refrigeration capacity at food bank and distribution sites across the nation. We also needed to expand our regional produce cooperatives to agri-hubs, so that we could allow industry experts to run those agri-hub operations, allowing the food banks to focus their time and energy on their other work. So through these agri-hubs, we're working to improve the mix of produce and protein and dairy across regions, especially since agri-sourcing is so regionally specific. For example, apples are predominantly being donated out of the Pacific Northwest, citrus out of Florida and California, sweet potatoes in the Southeast. But we also anticipate that we'll need to rely on purchasing or continue to rely on purchasing due to what we project will be substantial increased costs due to some of the ongoing challenges in supply chain. During 2020, our purchasing as a network was up a whopping 88%, accounting for 873 million meals. And we really don't see this ending anytime soon. So the pandemic upended our distribution model almost overnight. Examples include that contactless drive-through distributions that you've probably seen on the news, with volunteers placing the donations in the customers' trunks, partnering with the USDA to execute emergency feeding programs, and going directly to the clients through mobile pantries and temporarily available transportation, like school buses not being used were redeployed early on to deliver food to their traditional school bus stops on a daily basis. You've probably also seen in the news the fantastic utilization of the National Guard and also unemployed hospitality workers just to fill that volunteer gap. And then tapping new supply sources. For example, we worked with our food service distributors. We have national partners like Gordon Food Service, US Foods, Restaurant Depot, to just capture that excess food that they were not distributing to their regular customers like restaurants and caterers and convention centers. So these Herculean efforts could not have been possible without funds. As of last month, more than $326 million in grants was provided to the network to support COVID-19 response efforts. And this includes $263 million in cash funding and $63 million of additional direct support, such as food, offsetting transportation costs, and PPEs. What's really remarkable, I think, on this slide is the 6.1 billion meal total. And that's a dramatic increase due to the sudden skyrocketed need caused by the pandemic. To give you some perspective, the last 3 years prior to the pandemic, Feeding America provided approximately 4 billion meals per year. So from 4 billion to 6.1 billion meals. So let me tell you about Francine and May. There are seniors who carpool to pick up their meal boxes together to save money on fuel. It's just one of the ways they stretch their budgets to try to make ends meet. The pandemic hit them both hard. May works at a hospital, but saw her pay decrease with COVID-19 shutdowns. And then Francine's brother lost his job during the pandemic, so she took him in. And then recently, Francine got a kidney transplant. So they are just so appreciative of the healthy food from Golden Harvest Food Bank in Augusta, Georgia. So there's much more to do, and here's where we are headed. So while keeping the people facing hunger at the center of everything we do and addressing racial disparities, we're going to source more food, including nutritious food from new supply sources, because we need to make sure the food banks have the food they need to distribute to their partners. Also investing in infrastructure to build our network's capacity to distribute this food and do so equitably. Make it easier for people to get the food assistance they need. And you've probably seen and heard Feeding America in the news a lot on social media the past year. So we want to continue to capitalize on that moment when hunger is in the spotlight so we can get even more people working together to end this crisis. So out of those, just a couple key projects and activities I wanted to share to help us maximize food sourcing and sharing will be expanding our funding models for transportation and acquisition of food, so that food purchasing. So that gives us more buying power. We have an online system that our food bank members can use to purchase the food that they need at a considerable discount because of that buying power. And then facilitating that regional food sourcing model that I mentioned earlier. Really just working harder to advance forward planning and forecasting and you know, what's the next potential world event or local event or disaster that's going to impact the industry, and how can we prepare for that? And then creating a unified food sourcing and sharing platform, so a supply chain technology platform. Right now, our member food banks and their agencies are all on different platforms. So that's a huge investment of $23.6 million, but will make a dramatic difference. And then regarding expanding network and capacity, key projects include developing and providing robust services to build local capacity to source food, fundraise, and reduce those clients' barriers to access. Deploying some game-changing technology that enables the client's ability to order online what they need. Tools for agencies and their volunteer management for better communication. Developing education, shared language, and tools to address racial disparities in food security. And really focusing on equity by identifying those disproportionately affected populations and building their local food banks capacity. Meet Elmaria, a disabled Air Force vet. She picks up from her local food pantry, but shared that some of her neighbors who need food just can't access the pantry. So she picks up food to help them out. And we're sharing her story as an example of the barriers that keep people from getting the food they need. Lack of transportation, the pantry's hours of operations, not matching with their work schedules, and stigma, just to name a few. So we're working to change that, to make it easier for everyone to get food. So just a high-level overview of our FY21 goals and key measures include enhancing our role in partnership with the public sector, helping to secure 5.9 billion meals, and ensuring that 75% of food distributed is classified as foods to encourage. So what that represents are is foods that promote good health, such as fruits and vegetables, dairy, protein, and whole grains, expanding food bank capacity and capabilities, and increasing actions to end hunger. Now this slide represents our outcome and strategy pillars, and I just, which are feed, nourish, empower, and unite. And I just wanted to share what is measured and then how we measure progress. So how we ensure that we're making progress. And this is something that's shared network-wide with the food banks, so we're all on the same page. So by now, after you've had an opportunity to hear more about our pandemic-related challenges, successes, plans, and priorities, and have met real people and their stories of hunger, you're compelled to help, right? Well, there are a variety of ways you can support the Feeding America network professionally and personally. You can advocate, connect, donate, and volunteer. And you can just go to feedingamerica.org to learn more. And you can also, there's a Find Your Food Bank tool where you can put in your city or your zip code or your state and find the food bank that's nearest your home base or where you work. So in summary, here's what you need to know. The people facing hunger are at the center of all we do. We're working to address the inequities in who is facing hunger and who is accessing our services. We're working to remove the barriers to food security. And in doing all of this, we're making communities stronger. The pandemic and our response really shined a light on some of the greatest needs and the enormous potential for solutions. So we've built this year's priorities on all of these lessons learned and the growth opportunities. And our goal by 2025, in collaboration with our network and our partners, is to ensure access to enough nutritious food for people struggling with hunger and making meaningful progress toward ending hunger. So thanks again for your time and the opportunity to share our story. And here's my contact information if you'd like to connect. I'm also on LinkedIn and be happy to work with you in partnership to close that meal gap. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Shellie. So we are at time. If anybody needs to jump off, we understand, but we have a question in here. And if anybody wants to stay on, you're welcome to submit more questions in the chat. So from Kanisha, she was asking Shellie, considering the increased tapping of restaurant fast food entities to support the program, what's the procedure when products are determined to be unwholesome? Thinking logistics, will the acquisition of more refrigerated trucks be prioritized in the effort to maximize network capacity? Is there direct partnerships with local extension services, for example, encouraging urban produce gardens?
Absolutely. Yes to all your questions. And it really depends on the capacity of the food bank and their pickup partners. We have pickup partner agencies that we call agency enabled. So we know that those agencies have the training, they've got the passive equipment, the coolers, freezer packs, freezer blankets, and can safely source that food. But generally, when we work with restaurants and catering companies, when the food banks work with them locally, they establish a process so the product is frozen even before it's donated. And then what we try to do is connect them directly to the agency for pickup. So those frozen meals are taken to the agency, can be thawed safely, and then distributed to the clients. Because the last thing we want to do, we want to try to end that or eliminate that step of going back to the food bank with that frozen product and then have another step of distributing it to the agency. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
See any other questions in the chat, so I'll hand it back to Jason to close us out.
All right. Certainly, thank you both Kim and Shellie for your contribution. Again, we'd like to thank our members and sponsors for participating. I hope to get this edited by the end of the week and posted on fafp.net if you want to either review it or share it with friends and colleagues. We have another seminar planned for April 24th, although we're still working on confirming the speaker. So again, keep an eye out for that. We'll be sending out an email to the membership list as well. And with that, again, please go check out our FAFP website. That's where you're going to find out more information about upcoming webinars, as well as all the recordings from past webinars that we've had in the past. And so with that, I'd like to adjourn and thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.